Professor Vextalen Grimwick had seen many things in his 4 centuries of academic life across 17 different star systems. He had witnessed the great philosophical meltdown of Rigel 7, survived the infamous food fight of the Andorian Symposium, and even endured a 3-hour lecture on the mating habits of crystalline beings from the Horsehead Nebula. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared him for what was about to unfold at the Interdisciplinary Conference of Galactic Learning on the peaceful moon of Serenitatis Prime. The trouble began, as most academic disasters do, with a simple observation that should have been left unspoken. Corthac Blunderstone, a particularly pompous scholar from the Triangulum Galaxy, was holding court near the refreshment table when he spotted her. The human exchange student stood quietly by the quantum physics display, her auburn hair catching the artificial sunlight streaming through the dome's transparent aluminum ceiling. She was unremarkable in most ways, except for the distinctive scar that ran from her left temple down to her jaw, creating a jagged line that spoke of violence and survival. "Good grief!" Corthac exclaimed, his 3 eyes blinking in sequence as he adjusted his ceremonial academic robes. "Look at that poor creature. What sort of barbaric warfare did her species endure? That scar looks like it came from a plasma blade, or perhaps a gravitational shear accident." The human, who went by the name Delilah Crankshaft, turned slowly toward the sound of his voice. Her expression was the sort of carefully neutral look that anyone who had attended a faculty meeting would immediately recognize as dangerous. "I'm sorry, what did you just say?" Her voice carried the peculiar quality of someone who was about to make a point that would fundamentally alter the understanding of everyone within earshot. Corthac, being the sort of academic who had never learned when to stop talking, doubled down with the enthusiasm of someone approaching a black hole at maximum velocity. "Oh, don't be embarrassed, my dear. We're all scholars here. I was simply commenting on your obvious battle scar. Very impressive. Your species must have quite the warrior tradition to mark their young so distinctively." The silence that followed was the kind of silence that occurs just before a supernova, or just after someone has accidentally insulted a being capable of reducing them to their constituent atoms. Every conversation in the nearby vicinity ground to a halt as dozens of alien academics turned to witness what was clearly about to become either a learning experience or a medical emergency. Delilah's smile was the sort of smile that would have made a Cheshire cat immediately check its life insurance policy. "This scar," she said, gesturing to the mark on her face with the casual air of someone discussing the weather, "is from physical education class." The confusion that spread across Corthac's face was immediate and profound. His middle eye twitched, which in his species was generally considered a sign of severe mental distress. "Physical education? I don't understand. Is that some sort of military training program?" "Oh, no." Delilah's laugh was the sort of laugh that carries just enough genuine amusement to be truly terrifying. "It's completely normal. Every human child goes through it. This particular scar is from when I was 7 years old, playing something called Red Rover during recess." The word recess seemed to bounce around the academic gathering like a rubber ball in a room full of crystal sculptures. Various alien species began exchanging glances that clearly said, "Did she just say what I think she said?" Dr. Flibberty Gibbet Wormsworth, a distinguished educator from the Crab Nebula, cleared his throat with a sound like gravel in a cement mixer. "Forgive me, but did you say this injury occurred during leisure time?" "Well, technically it was during mandated physical activity," Delilah corrected helpfully. "You see, on Earth, we have this wonderful system where we gather all the children together in large groups and force them to participate in various competitive activities that frequently result in minor injuries, psychological trauma, and the occasional existential crisis. The academic conference was beginning to resemble a disaster movie, with various alien species slowly backing away from the human as if she were a particularly unstable quantum bomb. Professor Grimwick, who had been quietly observing this exchange while sipping his Rigelian coffee, nearly choked on his beverage. "I'm sorry," wheezed Professor Noodle-Whisk Frothingham from the Whirlpool Galaxy, "but are you suggesting that your species deliberately subjects its young to potentially harmful activities as part of their education?" "Oh, this is nothing!" Delilah's enthusiasm was the sort of enthusiasm that makes sensible people immediately look for the nearest exit. "This is just from the playground. You should see what we do in actual PE class. There's dodgeball, where we literally throw rubber spheres at each other as hard as we can. There's tackle football, where the entire point is to violently knock each other down. And don't even get me started on gymnastics, where we teach 8-year-olds to fling themselves through the air with the sort of reckless abandon that would make a stunt pilot nervous." The assembled academics were now staring at Delilah with the sort of horrified fascination typically reserved for watching a star collapse into a black hole. Dr. Mumblebottom Snizzlethwaite, a renowned child development expert from Proxima Centauri, was frantically taking notes on his holographic tablet. "But why?" The question came from at least 6 different species simultaneously, creating a harmonious chord of confusion that would have been beautiful if it hadn't been so deeply disturbing. Delilah shrugged, which was apparently the human equivalent of explaining the fundamental forces of the universe. "Character building, I suppose. Plus it's fun. Nothing builds friendships like accidentally giving your best friend a black eye during a particularly intense game of capture the flag." The word fun seemed to hang in the air like a particularly malevolent cloud. Professor Grimpwick was beginning to understand why humans had such a reputation for being unnaturally resilient. If this was what they considered recreational activity, what in the name of the Galactic Core did they consider serious training? "And this is normal." Dr. Twiddlebottom Fizzlebang from the Magellanic Clouds was clearly struggling with the concept. "All human children participate in these activities?" "Oh, absolutely!" Delilah's cheerful confirmation was delivered with the sort of matter-of-fact tone that one might use to describe the laws of thermodynamics. "It's mandatory. In fact, if you don't participate, you fail the class and have to repeat it." The implications of this statement were beginning to sink in across the conference like a slow-moving tide of horror. These weren't warriors who had been specially trained for combat. These weren't elite soldiers who had volunteered for dangerous missions. These were just regular people. Regular people who had survived what sounded like a systematic program of controlled violence disguised as education. Dr. Wobblebonk Thistlewhite, a specialist in interspecies psychology, was frantically calculating something on his personal computing device. "If I understand correctly, you're saying that every human has survived this educational process." "Well, most of us," Delilah confirmed cheerfully. "There are occasional casualties, but usually nothing more serious than a broken bone or a concussion, though I did know a kid who lost a tooth during a particularly aggressive game of kickball. But hey, that's what dental insurance is for." The phrase "occasional casualties" seemed to echo through the conference hall like a death knell. Professor Grimpwick was beginning to suspect that first contact protocols had been woefully inadequate. How do you prepare for diplomatic relations with a species that considers childhood trauma a normal part of development? Korthak, who had started this entire conversation, was now a rather interesting shade of purple that indicated severe psychological distress in his species. "But surely," he stammered, "surely this is a recent development, some sort of modern barbarism that your species has unfortunately adopted?" Delilah's laugh was the sort of laugh that suggests someone is about to deliver information that will fundamentally alter your understanding of reality. "Oh no, this is actually the gentle version. You should hear what my grandfather went through. In his day, they didn't even have safety equipment. He tells stories about playing something called Smear the Queer, where the entire point was to tackle whoever had the ball until they were completely buried under a pile of other children." The academic conference was now in full crisis mode. Several alien species were quietly hyperventilating, which in the case of the silicon-based life forms from Vega Prime created a rather disturbing whistling sound. Dr. Flibbertigibbet was frantically trying to contact his home planet to warn them about the terrifying implications of human educational practices. But the modern version is much more civilized, Delilah continued, apparently oblivious to the growing panic around her. We have helmets now, and mouth guards, and we usually stop the game if someone is bleeding too much. The phrase, bleeding too much, seemed to be the final straw for several conference attendees. Professor Noodle-Whisk collapsed into his chair with the sort of dramatic flair that suggested his entire worldview had just been fundamentally challenged. I need to understand, Doctor, Mumblebottom said, his voice carrying the desperate tone of someone trying to make sense of an incomprehensible universe. What possible evolutionary advantage could this serve? Why would any species deliberately traumatize their young? Delilah considered this question with the sort of thoughtful expression that suggested she was about to deliver a piece of wisdom that would either enlighten or completely destroy her audience. Well, it teaches you resilience, I suppose, and teamwork, and how to get back up after someone larger than you has knocked you down. Plus, it's excellent preparation for adult life. Adult life? The question came from Dr. Twiddlebottom, who was clearly dreading the answer. Oh, yes. Delilah's enthusiasm was reaching dangerous levels. After surviving elementary school PE, things like job interviews, tax audits, and traffic jams seem relatively manageable. It's all about perspective, really. The gathered academics were beginning to exchange glances that suggested they were collectively questioning every assumption they had ever made about human civilization. These weren't savage warriors who had somehow stumbled into space travel. These were people who had been systematically prepared for adversity from early childhood through what could only be described as institutional hazing. Professor Grimpwick, who had been quietly observing this cultural exchange, finally spoke up. Miss Crankshaft, I hope you won't take this the wrong way, but your species is absolutely terrifying. Oh, thank you, Delilah beamed with genuine pleasure. That's very kind of you to say, though honestly we're pretty normal by Earth standards. You should meet some of our athletes, or our military personnel, or anyone who's worked in customer service for more than 6 months. The mention of customer service seemed to push several alien academics over the edge of rational thought. Dr. Wobblebonk was now making small whimpering sounds that suggested he was having some sort of philosophical breakdown. What? Asked Dr. Flibbertigibbet in a voice that suggested he was approaching the limits of his sanity. Is customer service? Delilah's smile widened to proportions that would have made a shark nervous. Oh, it's this wonderful system where we take young adults and subject them to 8 hours a day of being verbally abused by strangers while maintaining a cheerful demeanor and pretending to care about their problems. The silence that followed this explanation was the sort of silence that occurs when an entire group of highly intelligent beings simultaneously realizes that they have been fundamentally wrong about something important. It was the silence of academics everywhere, discovering that their carefully constructed theories about human nature were not just incorrect, but laughably inadequate. And people volunteer for this? Dr. Snizzlethwaite's voice carried the sort of disbelief typically reserved for discussions of impossible mathematical concepts. Well, they need money to buy food and shelter, Delilah explained with the patient tone of someone explaining basic physics to a particularly slow child. So yes, they volunteer in the same way that you might volunteer to breathe air or avoid walking into traffic. The concept of survival-based motivation was clearly familiar to the assembled academics, but the idea that an entire species would create systems specifically designed to make survival more difficult seemed to be beyond their comprehension. But surely, Professor Noodle-Whisk said, with the desperate hope of someone clinging to the last remnants of their sanity, surely your government provides some sort of protection for these workers. Oh, absolutely, Delilah's cheerful confirmation was delivered with the sort of enthusiasm that suggested she was about to reveal something even more disturbing. We have laws that prevent customers from actually physically assaulting the employees most of the time, and there are usually security cameras to document any violations. The phrase "most of the time" seemed to echo through the conference hall like a particularly ominous thunderclap. The assembled academics were now looking at Delilah with the sort of horrified fascination typically reserved for observing dangerous natural phenomena from a safe distance. Dr. Mumblebottom, who had been frantically taking notes throughout this entire exchange, finally looked up from his tablet with the expression of someone who had just calculated the exact date of the heat death of the universe. "Miss Crankshaft, I think I'm beginning to understand why your species has such a reputation for being adaptable." "Oh, we're not that special," Delilah replied with false modesty. "Any species would develop similar traits if they went through the same educational process. It's really just a matter of survival of the fittest applied to childhood development." The casual mention of survival of the fittest in the context of elementary education was apparently the final piece of information that several alien academics could process. Dr. Flibberty-Gibbet made a sound that was somewhere between a sob and a laugh, while Professor Twiddlebottom began muttering something about the fundamental unfairness of the universe. "I think," said Professor Grimpwick slowly, "that we may need to completely revise our understanding of human civilization." "Why?" Delilah asked with genuine curiosity. "What did you think we were like?" The question hung in the air like a particularly awkward social faux pas. The assembled academics exchanged glances that suggested they were all remembering their previous assumptions about human nature and finding them suddenly, embarrassingly inadequate. "Well," Korthik said hesitantly, "we assume that your species' reputation for resilience came from some sort of military tradition, or perhaps harsh environmental conditions." "Oh, we have those too." Delilah's enthusiastic interruption was delivered with the sort of cheerful helpfulness that made everyone in the vicinity slightly nervous. "But those are just for the people who choose dangerous careers. The educational trauma is universal." The word universal seemed to settle over the conference like a particularly heavy blanket. The implications were staggering. Every human diplomat, every human scientist, every human they had ever met had survived this systematic preparation for adversity. No wonder they seemed so unnaturally calm in crisis situations. "Miss Crankshaft," Dr. Wobblebonk said, with the careful tone of someone trying not to provoke a dangerous animal, "would you mind describing a typical day in this physical education class?" Delilah's eyes lit up with the sort of enthusiasm that suggested she was about to share a particularly fond memory. "Oh, it was wonderful. We'd start with jumping jacks, which is where you jump up and down while flailing your arms and legs in a coordinated pattern that's designed to be just awkward enough to be embarrassing. Then we'd do push-ups, which is where you support your entire body weight on your arms while repeatedly lowering yourself to the ground and pushing back up again." The assembled academics were now taking notes with the sort of frantic intensity typically reserved for documenting the behavior of previously unknown life forms. "After the warm-up," Delilah continued cheerfully, "we'd usually play some sort of team sport. Dodgeball was always popular. The teacher would divide us into two groups and give each side a bunch of rubber balls. Then we'd try to hit the other team with the balls while avoiding being hit ourselves. If you got hit, you were out and had to sit on the sidelines and watch your teammates continue to suffer." The description of dodgeball was apparently too much for Dr. Snizzlethwaite, who began making small, choking sounds that suggested he was having difficulty processing this information. "But the really fun part," Delilah continued with growing enthusiasm, was that the last person standing on each team would usually be the most athletic kid in the class, which meant that everyone else got to experience the joy of being systematically eliminated by someone who was clearly superior to them in every measurable way. The concept of systematic elimination based on physical prowess was clearly familiar to the academics, but the idea that this was considered a positive educational experience seemed to be beyond their comprehension. And this was considered character building? Professor Noodle-Whisk's voice carried the sort of disbelief typically reserved for discussions of perpetual motion machines. Oh, absolutely! Delilah's confirmation was delivered with the sort of certainty that suggested she was stating a fundamental law of physics. It taught us that life isn't fair, that sometimes you'll lose even when you try your best, and that the only way to improve is to keep trying even when you're clearly outmatched. The assembled academics were now staring at Delilah with expressions that suggested they were witnessing the explanation of an entirely alien form of logic. The idea that deliberately creating situations where children were guaranteed to fail could be considered beneficial was apparently beyond their ability to process. But surely, Doctor, Mumblebottom said, with the desperate hope of someone trying to find a logical explanation for an illogical universe, surely there were activities where everyone could succeed. Delilah's laugh was the sort of laugh that suggested she was about to deliver information that would be even more disturbing than what had come before. Oh no, that would defeat the entire purpose. The whole point was to create situations where some people would succeed and others would fail. It's excellent preparation for the real world. The phrase real world seemed to echo through the conference hall like a particularly ominous warning. The assembled academics were beginning to suspect that their understanding of human civilization was not just incomplete, but fundamentally flawed. Miss Crankshaft, Professor Grimpwick said, with the careful tone of someone approaching a particularly dangerous piece of experimental equipment, could you describe what you mean by the real world? Delilah's smile was the sort of smile that suggested she was about to reveal something that would fundamentally alter everyone's understanding of reality. Oh, you know, jobs, relationships, taxes, traffic, waiting in line at the Department of Motor Vehicles, trying to get customer service on the phone, dealing with insurance companies, apartment hunting, dating, marriage, divorce, parenting, dealing with teenagers, caring for aging parents, and eventually dying. The list of human life experiences was delivered with the sort of cheerful matter-of-fact tone that one might use to describe the weather forecast. The assembled academics were now looking at Delilah with the sort of horrified fascination typically reserved for watching a natural disaster unfold. And you consider this normal? Dr. Flibberty-Gibbert's voice carried the sort of disbelief typically reserved for discussions of impossible mathematical concepts. Well, it's not like we have a choice, Delilah replied with the sort of philosophical acceptance that suggested she was discussing the fundamental nature of existence itself. Everyone dies eventually, and most people have to work for a living, so you might as well prepare for it. The casual acceptance of mortality and economic necessity was apparently the final piece of information that several alien academics could process. Dr. Twiddlebottom was now making small whimpering sounds that suggested he was having some sort of existential crisis. "I think," said Korthak slowly, "that I owe you an apology." "For what?" Delilah asked with genuine curiosity. "I assumed your scar was from some sort of battle," he said, his voice carrying the sort of shame typically reserved for admitting to serious academic misconduct. "I didn't realize it was from something much more terrifying." "More terrifying than battle?" Dr. Wobblebonk's voice carried the sort of confusion typically reserved for discussions of paradoxes. "Childhood," Korthak replied, with the sort of grim finality typically reserved for discussing the heat death of the universe. The assembled academics were now looking at Delilah with an entirely new level of respect. This wasn't just a survivor of some isolated traumatic event. This was someone who had successfully navigated an educational system specifically designed to prepare people for a lifetime of adversity, disappointment, and eventual death. "You know," Delilah said thoughtfully, "I never really thought about it that way. But I suppose you're right. Battle only lasts until someone wins or loses. Childhood lasts for 18 years, and then you have to deal with the consequences for the rest of your life." The comparison between battle and childhood was apparently the final straw for several conference attendees. Professor Noodlewhisk began laughing with the sort of slightly hysterical laughter that suggested he was approaching the limits of his sanity. "This explains so much," he exclaimed, his voice carrying the sort of revelation typically reserved for major scientific breakthroughs. "No wonder humans are so adaptable. No wonder you're so resilient. No wonder you seem so unnaturally calm in crisis situations. You've been preparing for them since you were children." The assembled academics were now nodding with the sort of understanding that comes from suddenly having a complex puzzle piece fall into place. The mystery of human nature wasn't really a mystery at all. It was simply the logical result of a species that had decided to systematically prepare their young for the inherent difficulties of existence. "I have to ask, Doctor," Mumblebottom said, with the sort of scientific curiosity that suggested he was approaching a particularly interesting research question. "What do human children who don't participate in these activities turn out like?" Delilah's expression became suddenly serious, as if she was about to reveal a particularly disturbing piece of information. "Well, they tend to have trouble adjusting to adult life. They often struggle with disappointment, failure, and conflict. Some of them become what we call helicopter parents, who try to protect their own children from experiencing any difficulties whatsoever." The concept of helicopter parents was apparently familiar to several alien species, based on the knowing looks that were exchanged around the conference hall. "And this is considered problematic?" Professor Grimpwick asked, with the sort of careful tone that suggested he was trying to understand a particularly complex theorem. "Oh, absolutely!" Delilah's enthusiasm was back in full force. "Children who aren't allowed to experience failure, disappointment, and minor physical injury tend to grow up completely unprepared for the realities of adult life. They have no resilience, no problem-solving skills, and no ability to cope with adversity." The assembled academics were now taking notes with the sort of frantic intensity typically reserved for documenting major scientific discoveries. The idea that deliberately exposing children to controlled adversity could be beneficial was apparently a revolutionary concept in most galactic civilizations. "So what you're saying, Doctor," Snizzlethwaite said slowly, "is that your species has developed an educational system specifically designed to create resilient adults by systematically exposing children to manageable levels of trauma." "Well, when you put it like that, it sounds kind of harsh," Delilah replied, with the sort of thoughtful consideration that suggested she was seeing her own culture from an outside perspective for the first time. "But yes, I suppose that's essentially what we do. We just call it school and pretend it's normal." The casual admission that an entire species had normalized childhood trauma as an educational tool was apparently the final piece of information that the assembled academics needed to completely revise their understanding of human civilization. "Miss Crankshaft," Professor Grimpwick said with the sort of formal tone typically reserved for official declarations, "I think you may have just solved one of the greatest mysteries in xenopsychology." "What mystery?" Delilah asked with genuine curiosity. "The question of why humans are so impossibly, unnaturally, ridiculously tough." The assembled academics began applauding, which in the case of several species involved tentacles, pseudopods, and various other appendages that created a rather impressive cacophony of appreciation. Delilah seemed genuinely surprised by the positive response. Really? She said, with the sort of pleased confusion that suggested she was still not entirely sure why everyone was so interested in her childhood experiences. I always thought we were pretty normal. I mean, sure, we have our problems, but doesn't everyone? The innocent question seemed to hang in the air like a particularly profound philosophical statement. The assembled academics were now looking at Delilah with the sort of respectful awe typically reserved for great thinkers and revolutionary scientists. "Miss Crankshaft," Dr. Wobblebonk said with the sort of reverent tone typically reserved for addressing distinguished colleagues, "I think you've just demonstrated why your species is so successful at adapting to new situations and solving complex problems." "Oh, that's just common sense," Delilah replied, with the sort of matter-of-fact tone that suggested she was discussing the weather. "If you've survived middle school, you can survive pretty much anything." The mention of middle school created a ripple of nervous laughter through the assembled academics. Several of them were now frantically taking notes, apparently trying to document every casual revelation about human educational practices. "I'm almost afraid to ask," Professor Noodlewhisk said, with the sort of cautious tone typically reserved for approaching dangerous experimental equipment. "But what exactly is middle school?" Delilah's smile was the sort of smile that suggested she was about to reveal something that would fundamentally alter everyone's understanding of human development. "Oh, that's the really fun part. That's when we take children who are going through puberty, with all the physical, emotional, and social changes that involves, and we pack them into overcrowded buildings with inadequate supervision and force them to compete with each other for academic, social, and romantic success." The description of middle school was apparently too much for Dr. Flibberty-Gibbet, who began making small, gasping sounds that suggested he was having difficulty breathing. "And this is considered educational." Dr. Twiddlebottom's voice carried the sort of disbelief typically reserved for discussions of perpetual motion machines. "Oh, absolutely." Delilah's confirmation was delivered with the sort of enthusiasm that suggested she was describing a particularly effective teaching method. "Nothing teaches you about the complexities of social dynamics like being trapped in a building with 300 other hormone-crazed adolescents for 6 hours a day." The assembled academics were now staring at Delilah with expressions that suggested they were witnessing the explanation of an entirely alien form of logic. The idea that deliberately creating a pressure cooker environment for developing humans could be considered beneficial was apparently beyond their ability to process. "But the best part," Delilah continued with growing enthusiasm, "is that this all happens right when children are most vulnerable to peer pressure, most confused about their identity, and most likely to make spectacularly bad decisions. The concept of timing educational trauma to coincide with maximum psychological vulnerability was apparently the final piece of information that several alien academics could process without having some sort of breakdown. "I think," said Korthak slowly, "that I'm beginning to understand why humans have such a reputation for being able to handle impossible situations." "Oh, we don't handle impossible situations," Delilah corrected cheerfully. "We just have a lot of experience with situations that feel impossible at the time, but turn out to be survivable if you're stubborn enough to keep trying." The distinction between impossible and merely very difficult was apparently a profound insight that resonated with several alien species. Dr. Mumblebottom was now nodding with the sort of understanding that comes from suddenly having a complex philosophical concept explained in simple terms. "So what you're saying," Professor Grimpwick said, with the sort of careful tone typically reserved for summarizing important scientific findings, "is that your entire species has been systematically trained from childhood to persist in the face of adversity, adapt to changing circumstances, and maintain hope even when success seems unlikely." "Well, that's a very fancy way of putting it," Delilah replied, with the sort of amused appreciation that suggested she was seeing her own culture from an outside perspective for the first time. But yes, I suppose that's what we do. We just call it growing up and pretend it's normal. The casual admission that an entire species had normalized systematic preparation for life's difficulties was apparently the final revelation that the assembled academics needed to completely transform their understanding of human civilization. Dr. Flibbertigibbet suddenly stood up with the sort of dramatic flair that suggested he was about to make an important announcement. Ladies, gentlemen, and distinguished beings of various configurations, I believe we need to completely restructure our approach to understanding human psychology. The suggestion that an entire academic discipline might need to be overhauled based on a single conversation was apparently not as shocking as it might have been under normal circumstances. Several academics were already nodding in agreement. I propose, Dr. Mumblebottom added with growing excitement, that we establish a new field of study dedicated specifically to understanding the long-term psychological effects of what humans apparently consider normal childhood experiences. The idea of creating an entirely new academic discipline was apparently catching on rapidly. Dr. Wobblebonk was already making notes on his tablet, presumably outlining potential research projects. We could call it comparative developmental trauma studies, Professor Noodlewhisk suggested, with the sort of enthusiasm typically reserved for discussing groundbreaking scientific discoveries. Or perhaps interspecies resilience theory, Dr. Twiddlebottom countered with equal enthusiasm. The academic conference was beginning to resemble a particularly energetic brainstorming session, with various alien species calling out suggestions for research topics and methodological approaches. Delilah watched this unfold with the sort of bemused expression that suggested she was still not entirely sure how her perfectly normal childhood experiences had apparently revolutionized an entire field of study. "I have a question," she said finally, raising her hand with the sort of polite patience that suggested she had extensive experience with academic settings. "What do your children do for fun?" The question seemed to bring the enthusiastic academic discussion to a sudden halt. The assembled academics exchanged glances that suggested they were collectively realizing that their own childhood experiences might seem equally bizarre from a human perspective. "Well," Dr. Mumblebottom said hesitantly, "on my homeworld, children spend most of their time in meditation chambers, practicing telepathic communication and studying ancient philosophical texts." "That sounds very peaceful," Delilah replied with genuine interest. "Do they ever play any games?" "Games?" Dr. Mumblebottom's confusion was genuine and profound. "What sort of games?" "Oh, you know, tag, hide and seek, racing, climbing trees, building forts, having snowball fights, playing pretend, making up stories." Delilah's list of childhood activities was delivered with the sort of casual enthusiasm that suggested these were obviously universal experiences. The assembled academics were now staring at Delilah with expressions that suggested they were witnessing the description of an entirely alien form of existence. The idea that children might engage in unstructured physical activity purely for enjoyment was apparently a foreign concept to most galactic civilizations. Building forts. Professor Noodlewhisk's voice carried the sort of fascination typically reserved for discussing advanced theoretical physics. "Oh, sure." Delilah's enthusiasm was reaching dangerous levels again. "You find some furniture, or maybe some branches and leaves if you're outside, and you build a little shelter where you can hide from grown-ups and tell secrets and eat snacks." The concept of children deliberately hiding from adult supervision was apparently shocking to several alien species. Dr. Flibbertigibbet was making notes with the sort of frantic intensity that suggested he was documenting the discovery of a new form of life. "And adults allow this?" Dr. Wobblebonk's voice carried the sort of disbelief typically reserved for discussions of impossible phenomena. "Well, most of the time," Delilah replied with the sort of casual qualification that suggested there were interesting exceptions to this rule. Sometimes they make you clean up the mess afterward. And occasionally someone gets in trouble if the fort building gets too elaborate and starts involving power tools or structural modifications to the house. The mention of children having access to power tools was apparently the final straw for several conference attendees. Dr. Twiddlebottom made a sound that was somewhere between a gasp and a sob. Power tools. The question came from at least 4 different species simultaneously, creating a chord of horror that would have been musically interesting if it hadn't been so deeply disturbing. "Oh, not usually," Delilah assured them with the sort of cheerful qualification that somehow made everything worse. "That's more of a teenage thing. Though I did know a kid whose dad taught him how to use a circular saw when he was 12. But that was considered pretty unusual, even by our standards." The casual mention of 12-year-olds operating dangerous machinery was apparently beyond the processing capability of several alien academics. Professor Noodlewhisk was now making small whimpering sounds that suggested he was approaching some sort of cognitive overload. "Miss Crankshaft," Professor Grimpwick said with the sort of careful tone typically reserved for approaching potentially explosive situations, "I think we may need to completely revise our understanding of not just human education, but human childhood in general." "Really?" Delilah's genuine surprise was endearing and terrifying in equal measure. "I always thought childhood was pretty much the same everywhere. Don't all species let their young play and explore and occasionally get into trouble?" The innocent question seemed to hang in the air like a particularly profound philosophical statement. The assembled academics were now looking at each other with expressions that suggested they were collectively realizing that their own species' approach to child-rearing might be the exception rather than the rule. "On my home world, Dr. Snizzlethwaite said slowly, children are kept in carefully controlled environments until they reach intellectual maturity. They spend their time in guided learning experiences designed to maximize cognitive development while minimizing any possibility of physical or emotional harm." "That sounds very safe," Delilah replied thoughtfully. "But don't they get bored? Don't they want to run around and climb things and see what happens if they mix different substances together in unsupervised experiments?" The concept of children engaging in unsupervised experiments was apparently a new and terrifying idea to most of the assembled academics. Dr. Liberty Gibbet was now taking notes with the sort of desperate intensity that suggested he was trying to document the complete overthrow of everything he thought he knew about child development. "Unsupervised experiments?" Dr. Wobblebonk's voice carried the sort of horror typically reserved for discussing natural disasters. "Oh, sure." Delilah's enthusiasm was apparently immune to the growing panic around her. "Making volcanoes with baking soda and vinegar, seeing what happens when you put different things in the microwave, mixing cleaning chemicals to see what colors they make, trying to build rockets out of toilet paper tubes and firecrackers, attempting to create perpetual motion machines using rubber bands and paper clips." The list of potentially dangerous childhood experiments was apparently too much for Dr. Mumblebottom, who began hyperventilating in a way that suggested his species' respiratory system was not designed to handle this level of stress. "And your parents just let you do these things?" Professor Noodlewhisk's voice carried the sort of disbelief typically reserved for discussions of impossible mathematical theorems. "Well, technically they told us not to," Delilah replied, with the sort of mischievous grin that suggested she was about to reveal the most disturbing information yet. "But they couldn't watch us all the time. And besides, how else were we supposed to learn about cause and effect, chemistry, physics, and the important life lesson that some mistakes have more spectacular consequences than others?" The concept of learning through potentially dangerous trial and error was apparently a revolutionary idea to most galactic civilizations. Several academics were now frantically calculating the statistical probability of species survival under such conditions. But surely, Dr. Twiddlebottom said, with the desperate hope of someone clinging to the last remnants of rational thought, surely there were some safety protocols in place. Oh, absolutely. Delilah's cheerful confirmation was delivered with the sort of enthusiasm that suggested she was about to make everything worse. We had very strict safety rules, like don't stick metal objects in electrical outlets, don't eat things you find on the ground, and if it's on fire, don't touch it. The fact that these needed to be stated as explicit rules was apparently more disturbing than the rules themselves. Dr. Flibberty-Gibbet was now making small, sobbing sounds that suggested his understanding of rational child development had been completely shattered. And children actually needed to be told these things? Doctor. Wobblebonk's voice carried the sort of amazement typically reserved for witnessing impossible phenomena. Oh, we knew they were dangerous, Delilah explained, with the patient tone of someone clarifying an obvious point. That's what made them interesting. The whole point was to see how close you could get to actual danger without experiencing actual consequences. The idea that children would deliberately seek out dangerous situations for entertainment was apparently beyond the comprehension of several alien species. Professor Grimpwick was now staring at Delilah with the sort of expression that suggested he was witnessing the explanation of an entirely alien form of consciousness. "Miss Crankshaft," he said slowly, "I'm beginning to understand why your species is the only one in the galaxy that actively volunteers for dangerous missions." "Do we?" Delilah asked with genuine curiosity. "I always thought everyone did that. I mean, if nobody volunteers for the dangerous stuff, how does it get done?" The innocent question seemed to highlight a fundamental difference in species psychology that none of the assembled academics had previously considered. Most galactic civilizations apparently preferred to avoid dangerous situations entirely, while humans seemed to view them as interesting challenges. On most worlds, Dr. Snizzlethwaite explained carefully, dangerous tasks are either automated, performed by specially designed artificial intelligences, or simply not done. But that seems so inefficient. Delilah's protest was delivered with the sort of genuine concern that suggested she was trying to help solve a serious problem. What if the artificial intelligence breaks down? What if the automation fails? What if something happens that nobody planned for? The concept of planning for unplanned events was apparently a uniquely human approach to problem solving. Several academics were now taking notes with the sort of intensity that suggested they were documenting a major paradigm shift in their understanding of risk management. "We generally try to plan for all possible contingencies," Professor Noodlewhisk explained, with the sort of careful precision that suggested he was discussing a fundamental principle of rational civilization. "But that's impossible!" Delilah's laugh was the sort of laugh that suggested she found the entire concept genuinely amusing. "There are always things you can't plan for. That's what makes life interesting. Besides, if you could plan for everything, where would be the fun in discovery and exploration?" The idea that unpredictability might be considered a positive feature of existence was apparently a revolutionary concept to most galactic civilizations. Dr. Mumblebottom was now staring at Delilah with the sort of expression that suggested he was witnessing the explanation of an entirely alien philosophy of life. "You consider uncertainty to be enjoyable?" he asked with the sort of careful tone typically reserved for discussing incomprehensible theoretical concepts. "Oh, absolutely!" Delilah's enthusiasm was reaching dangerous levels again. "The best adventures are the ones where you have no idea what's going to happen. Where would be the excitement in exploring a new planet if you already knew everything about it? Where would be the challenge in solving a problem if you already had all the answers?" The assembled academics were now exchanging glances that suggested they were collectively realizing that their entire approach to scientific inquiry might be fundamentally different from human methodology. The idea that not knowing something could be considered exciting rather than terrifying was apparently beyond their previous experience. "But surely," Dr. Flibbertigibbet said, with the desperate hope of someone trying to find common ground, "surely you prefer situations where you can predict the outcome." "Well, some situations," Delilah replied thoughtfully. "Like when you're trying to land a spacecraft or perform surgery or build a bridge. But for everyday life, for learning and growing and having fun, predictability is boring." The casual dismissal of predictability as boring was apparently the final piece of information that several alien academics needed to completely restructure their understanding of human psychology. Dr. Wobblebonk was now making notes with the sort of frantic intensity that suggested he was trying to document the complete overthrow of everything he thought he knew about rational behavior. "Miss Crankshaft," Professor Grimpwick said with the sort of formal tone typically reserved for making important academic announcements, "I think you've just explained why humans are the only species in the galaxy that actually seems to enjoy first contact situations." "Do we?" Delilah's genuine surprise was endearing and slightly terrifying. "I always thought everyone would be excited about meeting new people. I mean, think about all the new things you could learn, all the different perspectives and ideas and ways of looking at the universe." The concept of viewing first contact as an exciting learning opportunity rather than a potentially dangerous unknown was apparently unique to human psychology. Several academics were now nodding with the sort of understanding that comes from suddenly having a complex puzzle piece fall into place. "Most species," Dr. Twiddlebottom explained carefully, "approach first contact with extreme caution. We spend decades or even centuries preparing detailed protocols, running risk assessments, and developing contingency plans for every possible scenario. But by the time you've done all that planning, haven't you already missed most of the fun?" Delilah's question was delivered with the sort of innocent curiosity that suggested she was genuinely trying to understand an alien way of thinking. The idea that thorough preparation might actually detract from an experience was apparently a revolutionary concept to most galactic civilizations. Professor Noodlewhisk was now staring at Delilah with the sort of expression that suggested he was witnessing the explanation of an entirely alien approach to life itself. "You consider spontaneity to be valuable?" he asked with the sort of careful tone typically reserved for discussing dangerous experimental procedures. "Oh, sure." Delilah's confirmation was delivered with the sort of enthusiasm that suggested she was discussing an obviously beneficial concept. "Some of the best experiences in life are the ones that happen when you're not expecting them. The conversations that start by accident, the discoveries you make when you're looking for something else, the friendships that develop in completely unexpected ways." The assembled academics were now looking at Delilah with expressions that suggested they were witnessing the explanation of an entirely alien philosophy of existence. The idea that unplanned events could be considered positive was apparently beyond their previous experience. "But surely," Dr. Snizzlethwaite said, with the desperate hope of someone trying to find logical common ground, "surely you recognize the value of careful planning and systematic preparation." "Oh, absolutely." Delilah's enthusiastic agreement was somehow more disturbing than disagreement would have been. "Planning is essential for the important stuff, but you can't plan for everything, and if you try to, you'll spend so much time planning that you'll never actually do anything." The concept of balancing preparation with action was apparently a complex philosophical problem that most galactic civilizations had solved by eliminating action altogether. Several academics were now taking notes with the sort of intensity that suggested they were documenting a major breakthrough in practical philosophy. "So what you're suggesting," Professor Grimtwick said slowly, is that your species has developed a cultural approach that deliberately incorporates both systematic preparation and spontaneous adaptation. Well, when you put it like that, it sounds very fancy, Delilah replied, with the sort of amused appreciation that suggested she was seeing her own culture from an outside perspective for the first time. But yes, I suppose that's what we do. We plan for what we can plan for, and then we improvise when things don't go according to plan. The casual admission that an entire species had normalized improvisation as a standard problem-solving technique was apparently the final revelation that the assembled academics needed to completely transform their understanding of human civilization. Ladies, gentlemen, and distinguished beings of various configurations, Professor Grimtwick announced, with the sort of formal tone typically reserved for major academic declarations. I believe we have just witnessed the explanation of why humans are the most adaptable species in the known galaxy. The assembled academics began applauding again, creating an even more impressive cacophony of appreciation that included clicking, whistling, humming, and various other sounds that suggested profound respect and admiration. Delilah seemed genuinely bewildered by the positive response. Really? She said with the sort of pleased confusion that suggested she was still not entirely sure why everyone was so interested in her perfectly normal observations about human culture. I always thought adaptability was just common sense. I mean, things change. You have to be able to change with them or you get left behind. The innocent observation seemed to hang in the air like a particularly profound piece of wisdom. The assembled academics were now looking at Delilah with the sort of respectful awe typically reserved for great philosophers who have just revealed a fundamental truth about the nature of existence. Miss Crankshaft, Dr. Wobblebonk said with the sort of reverent tone typically reserved for addressing distinguished colleagues, I think you've just provided the key to understanding not just human psychology, but the fundamental principles of successful species development. Have I? Delilah's genuine surprise was endearing and slightly concerning. Well, if it helps with your research, I suppose that's good, though I should probably mention that not all humans would agree with my perspective. We're a pretty diverse species, and we have lots of different opinions about pretty much everything. The mention of internal diversity was apparently interesting to several alien academics, based on the sudden increase in note-taking activity around the conference hall. And how do you handle that diversity? Dr. Mumblebottom asked, with the sort of scientific curiosity that suggested he was approaching a particularly complex research question. Delilah considered this question with the sort of thoughtful expression that suggested she was about to reveal something important about human social dynamics. Well, mostly we argue about it, she said, with the sort of matter-of-fact tone that suggested this was an obviously reasonable approach. We debate, we discuss, we sometimes get into heated disagreements, and eventually we either reach some sort of compromise or we agree to disagree and move on to arguing about something else. The concept of productive disagreement was apparently foreign to most galactic civilizations. Several academics were now staring at Delilah with expressions that suggested they were witnessing the explanation of an entirely alien form of social organization. And this works. Professor Noodlewhisk's voice carried the sort of disbelief typically reserved for discussions of impossible phenomena. Well, it's messy and inefficient, and sometimes it takes a really long time to reach any kind of consensus, Delilah admitted, with the sort of honest assessment that suggested she was well aware of the limitations of human social systems. But it also means that we consider lots of different perspectives before making important decisions, and we're usually able to adapt our approach when new information becomes available. The idea that inefficiency might actually be beneficial was apparently a revolutionary concept to most galactic civilizations. Doctor, Flibbertigibbet was now making notes with the sort of frantic intensity that suggested he was trying to document a complete paradigm shift in his understanding of optimal social organization. "So you're saying, Doctor," Twiddlebottom said slowly, "that your species has developed a social system that deliberately incorporates multiple conflicting viewpoints as a mechanism for improving decision-making quality." "Well, that's a very academic way of putting it," Delilah replied, with the sort of amused appreciation that suggested she was impressed by the formal description of her species' chaotic approach to governance. "But yes, I suppose that's what we do. We figure that if you only listen to people who agree with you, you're probably missing something important." The assembled academics were now nodding with the sort of understanding that comes from suddenly having a complex social phenomenon explained in simple terms. The mystery of human adaptability wasn't really a mystery at all. It was simply the logical result of a species that had developed cultural mechanisms for incorporating multiple perspectives and adapting to changing circumstances. "Miss Crankshaft," Professor Grimpwick said with the sort of formal tone typically reserved for making important announcements, "I think you've just solved another major puzzle in xenosociology." "Another one?" Delilah's pleased surprise was genuine and endearing. "What puzzle?" "The question of how your species manages to maintain social cohesion despite having such high levels of internal disagreement." The assembled academics were now looking at Delilah with expressions that suggested they were witnessing the explanation of an advanced form of social engineering that their own civilizations had never considered. "Oh, we don't always maintain social cohesion," Delilah corrected with the sort of honest qualification that somehow made everything more rather than less impressive. "Sometimes we have civil wars, revolutions, political upheavals, and various other forms of spectacular social breakdown." The casual mention of periodic social collapse was apparently more reassuring than disturbing to the assembled academics. Several of them were now nodding with the sort of relief that comes from discovering that even humans had limitations. "But the interesting thing," Delilah continued thoughtfully, "is that we usually manage to put ourselves back together afterward, often in ways that are better than what we had before." The concept of using social breakdown as an opportunity for improvement was apparently beyond the comprehension of several alien species. Dr. Wobblebonk was now making small whimpering sounds that suggested he was approaching cognitive overload again. "You use chaos as a tool for social advancement?" he asked, with the sort of voice that suggested he was discussing something fundamentally impossible. "Well, we don't usually plan for chaos," Delilah replied, with the sort of thoughtful consideration that suggested she was trying to be accurate about her species' relationship with disorder. "But when it happens anyway, we try to make the best of it. And sometimes the best solutions come from situations where all the old rules have been thrown out and you have to figure out completely new ways of doing things." The idea that destruction could be a precursor to innovation was apparently a concept that resonated with several academic disciplines. Professor Noodlewhisk was now taking notes with the sort of excitement that suggested he was connecting this insight to various theoretical frameworks in his own field. "This explains so much about human scientific methodology," he exclaimed with the sort of enthusiasm typically reserved for major breakthroughs. "No wonder you're so good at paradigm shifts. No wonder you're so comfortable with overturning established theories. You've been practicing creative destruction since childhood." The assembled academics were now buzzing with the sort of excited conversation that occurs when a new theoretical framework suddenly makes a whole range of previously inexplicable phenomena comprehensible. "I'm sorry," Delilah said with the sort of polite confusion that suggested she was having trouble following the increasingly academic nature of the discussion. "But what's creative destruction?" The innocent question seemed to bring the enthusiastic academic discussion to a sudden halt. The assembled academics exchanged glances that suggested they were collectively realizing that they might be overthinking what was, from a human perspective, simply normal behavior. Creative destruction, Professor Grimpwick explained carefully, is a theoretical concept that describes how innovation often requires the elimination of existing systems in order to make room for new and better approaches. Oh! Delilah's face lit up with the sort of understanding that suggested she was making an important connection. You mean like how you have to tear down an old building before you can build a new one in the same space? The simple analogy seemed to perfectly capture a complex theoretical concept that most academics spent years studying. Several of them were now nodding with the sort of appreciation that comes from having a difficult idea explained in immediately comprehensible terms. Exactly. Dr. Mumblebottom's enthusiasm was genuine and slightly overwhelming. But most species find the destruction part so traumatic that they avoid it entirely, which means they never get to the creation part. But that seems so limiting. Delilah's protest was delivered with the sort of genuine concern that suggested she was trying to help solve a serious problem. I mean, everything gets old and worn out eventually. If you never replace anything, you just end up with a bunch of outdated systems that don't work very well anymore. The observation that avoiding change leads to stagnation was apparently a profound insight that resonated with several alien civilizations who had been struggling with exactly this problem. Miss Crankshaft, Dr. Snizzlethwaite said, with the sort of reverent tone typically reserved for addressing great teachers, I think you've just provided a solution to one of the most persistent problems in galactic civilization development. Have I? Delilah's genuine surprise was becoming a recurring theme. What problem? The tendency for advanced civilizations to become so risk-averse that they stop innovating and eventually stagnate. The assembled academics were now looking at Delilah with expressions that suggested they were witnessing the explanation of a fundamental principle of successful civilization management that their own species had somehow missed. Oh, that does sound like a problem, Delilah agreed thoughtfully. But couldn't you solve it by just trying new things sometimes? I mean, not all new things have to be dangerous or destructive. Some innovations are just improvements. The concept of incremental improvement as an alternative to revolutionary change was apparently a middle ground that most galactic civilizations had never considered. Several academics were now frantically taking notes on what appeared to be a completely new approach to managing technological and social development. But how do you decide which new things are worth trying? Dr. Flibbertigibbet asked, with the sort of scientific curiosity that suggested he was approaching a particularly important research question. Delilah considered this question with the sort of thoughtful expression that suggested she was about to reveal something important about human decision-making processes. Well, usually we just try stuff and see what happens, she said, with the sort of matter-of-fact tone that suggested this was an obviously reasonable approach. If it works, great. If it doesn't work, we try something else. If it works but causes unexpected problems, we try to fix the problems. If it fails spectacularly, at least we learned something interesting. The casual description of trial and error as a systematic methodology was apparently revolutionary to most galactic civilizations. Dr. Wobblebonk was now staring at Delilah with the sort of expression that suggested he was witnessing the explanation of an entirely alien approach to knowledge acquisition. You use failure as a learning tool, he asked with the sort of voice that suggested he was discussing something fundamentally impossible. Oh, sure. Delilah's enthusiasm was back in full force. Failure is one of the best learning tools. Success tells you that what you did worked, but failure tells you exactly what didn't work, which is often much more useful information. The idea that negative results could be more valuable than positive results was apparently a concept that resonated with several scientific disciplines. Professor Noodlewisk was now nodding with the sort of excited understanding that comes from suddenly having a persistent research problem reframed in a completely new way. This explains why human scientific literature includes so many negative results, he exclaimed, with the sort of enthusiasm typically reserved for major discoveries. Most species only publish successful experiments, but humans actually document their failures. The assembled academics were now buzzing with excitement again, apparently recognizing the implications of this approach for their own research methodologies. "Well, of course we document our failures," Delilah said, with the sort of patient tone that suggested she was explaining something obvious. "How else would other people know what not to try? Why would you want everyone to waste time repeating the same mistakes when they could be making new mistakes and learning new things?" The concept of mistakes as a finite resource that should be efficiently distributed across a population was apparently beyond the comprehension of several alien species. Dr. Twiddlebottom was now making small, choking sounds that suggested he was having difficulty processing this level of systematic optimization of failure. "You've systematized error," he managed to gasp out between choking sounds. "Well, that's a very fancy way of putting it," Delilah replied, with the sort of amused appreciation that suggested she was seeing her own culture from yet another unexpected perspective. "But I suppose we have. We share our mistakes so other people can avoid them. We study our failures to understand what went wrong, and we use our errors as stepping stones to better solutions." The assembled academics were now staring at Delilah with expressions that suggested they were witnessing the explanation of the most advanced form of knowledge management in the known galaxy. "Miss Crankshaft," Professor Grimpwick said with the sort of formal tone typically reserved for making groundbreaking announcements, "I think you've just revolutionized our understanding of optimal learning theory." "Have I?" Delilah's bewildered pleasure was becoming endearingly predictable. "Well, I suppose that's nice, though I should probably mention that we didn't really set out to revolutionize anything. We just do what seems to work." The casual admission that humans had accidentally developed advanced theoretical frameworks through practical necessity was apparently the final piece of information that the assembled academics needed to completely transform their understanding of the relationship between theory and practice. And in that moment, surrounded by some of the galaxy's most distinguished scholars, all of whom were frantically revising their fundamental assumptions about education, psychology, sociology, and civilization development based on the perfectly ordinary observations of a perfectly normal human being, Delilah Crankshaft finally understood why her species had such an unusual reputation throughout the galaxy. "You know what's really funny?" she said, with the sort of thoughtful amusement that suggested she was about to deliver one final, devastating insight. "We always thought everyone else was the weird ones.